A warm welcome to all of you on this day of transition, I guess, between lovely weather and what looks like snow and Arctic vortex. We appreciate very much your coming to what I think will be a very important, perhaps not enjoyable, but a very important event. Welcome to the Berkley Center. For those of you who have not been here, and I see some people who we know well, but some of you have not been here, the Berkley Center is about 9 years old, about to go into its 10th year at Georgetown University. It's an unusual organization attached to the president's office at Georgetown, very much a multidisciplinary focus on religion, peace, and world affairs. And I'm Catherine Marshall, and I direct the Religion and Global Development part of the Berkley Center program. I also welcome you on behalf of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. WFDD is a small but powerful organization with a fascinating pedigree. It was born in the World Bank out of the recognition that the world's leading advocates for the poor and for marginalized people, the development organizations and religious organizations, were often in tension and rarely work together in effective partnerships. So WFDD is about 15 years old and is based here at the Berkley Center. We have been working here at Georgetown for some 9 years on what we call mapping, which is an effort akin to journalism, where we ask who's doing what, where, why, when, with what resources, to what ends, etc. And looking at all different regions of the world and looking at many different topics, essentially covering most of the Millennium Development Goals in one way or another. We look at corruption, malaria, housing, water supply, sanitation, family planning, etc. And there is one theme that has come up in every world region and in every topical review that we have done, and that is religious attitudes towards women and towards gender differences. And it's a fascinating and perhaps to us rather surprising finding that in the development community, when in the framework of human rights, but also in terms of economic, social approaches, the role of equality of women is absolutely essential. Education of girls, empowerment of women, etc. And interestingly, within many religious organizations, gender equality is also a principle. But for many development organizations, one of the main reasons they give for their hesitation in working with religious organizations, what was described by someone last Friday at the United Nations as a litmus test, is the perception of patriarchy and a tepid commitment to true equality between men and women. And as a result, we have launched a project jointly with the Berkley Center and WFDD to explore these issues and attitudes. We know that there's a diversity of views. We know that there's a lot of misconceptions. We know there are gaps in knowledge. And so we always start with that. But we also are working to create what we call safe spaces to talk about tough issues. And one of the tough issues is domestic violence. It's a tough issue for many reasons, for many years it was assumed that it was somebody else's problem and was relatively minor. One of the shocking facts that's come out of recent studies is that perhaps as much as half of people who've experienced domestic violence have never spoken about it to a living soul. But it's no longer possible to see it as an isolated issue. It is a central issue that involves women's bodies and women's lives. And so we're delighted to welcome you here to this discussion, which we see as part of a continuing reflection with a question mark behind it of what more can and should we do to advance the discussion of these issues on Georgetown's agenda, on the development agenda, in our own work program. And with that, I will turn this over to my poor crippled colleague, Crystal Corman, who has taken the lead role in organizing our work on this topic and in bringing us here today. And I think I will wind up at the end, so.
I'm going to interrupt Crystal just quickly with a few logistics. I'm Melody Fox Ahmed. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs here at the Berkley Center. Welcome, everyone. Just wanted to clarify the food outside. There's no pork. Also, restrooms, if you need them, down the hall to the right through the door. You can get back in. A couple of folks were asking about Wi-Fi. We have a very awkward system. It's GU Visitor, and there's a terrible password, so I'll pass this around if anyone wants it. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this. And we have been tweeting about the Women, Religion, Family Project under the hashtag FaithFem, so please feel free to tweet. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. Today I won't take too much time so that we can get to our distinguished and diverse panel, but I would like to start off by saying that we've pulled together 5 amazing women, and Rick Santos unfortunately is not able to be with us today as he is ill. And I will go ahead and introduce them. I handed out and produced a biography sheet, so you can read their full bios here, and this is in the order within they will speak. Just based on my own physical ability today, I will briefly introduce the 5 of them and then let them come up, speak for about 7 minutes, and then after the presentation we'll have time for small group dialogue where we'll break into small groups and we have some questions to kick off some discussion, and the speakers will also diversify and go out and merge with you so you can engage with them then. And then we'll finish with coming back together to see if there are any questions or feedback from the large group, and we'll wrap up again with comments from Catherine Marshall. So we begin today with Laura Kovacs. She's the director for the Women's Center at Georgetown University, and she's also an adjunct faculty member at the Women and Gender Studies program here at the university. We'll follow with Emily Love Esworthy. She is the communications officer for IMA World Health, and she also is the manager of the faith-based initiative, the U.S. initiative of We Will Speak Out. Again, it's an initiative she'll explain more about ending sexual and gender-based violence. Donna Hakimian is here. She's a representative for gender equality and the advancement of women for the Bahá'ís of the United States. She works on a variety of gender topics, including gender-based violence. Aisha Rahman, who's the executive director of Karama, is with us today. She'll be able to speak with us from the perspective of her organization. And we'll wrap up with Jen Lueltel-Schwier. She's the associate director for sexual assault response and prevention services in health education services here at Georgetown University. I think that we'll find the speakers will be able to present from a variety of perspectives, different faith traditions, and hopefully will provide for us a rich background and a foundation to dialogue. So with that, we'll go ahead and begin. I'll minimize this and we'll welcome Laura up to the mic.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It is fantastic to be here. This is my first time working with the Berkley Center, and so on behalf of the Women's Center, it's so fantastic to be here with you. I am, like Crystal said, I'm director of the Women's Center. I've been at Georgetown University since 2008, but have also worked with Georgetown around these issues for more than that, going back to 2003 when I worked at my sister's place here in the city, which is a domestic violence organization, and working with a lot of Georgetown faculty and staff and addressing these particular issues for our campus community. So a few stints with Georgetown over these last years. Professionally, I have been involved with the anti-violence movement as an advocate, an educator, and writer, and working on gender-based violence issues for over 15 years. Needless to say, this is my passion. These are the issues that I have devoted my life to, and it's coming through in these different spaces, whether it be community or within the higher education community. The Georgetown Women's Center opened its doors 25 years ago, and addressing sexual violence on campus, domestic violence were some of the major reasons why the center was created. And we continue to address these issues today through education, programming, and engagement with the entire Georgetown community. I was asked today to speak a little bit to some language and prevalence around these issues to sort of set the stage for our conversation today. As we think about these issues of gender-based violence, I think language is always the first thing that we start with. It's something we talk about in the class that I teach on these issues, that language is so powerful, especially around issues of sexual assault and domestic violence. We often, when we hear gender, we often hear, well, this is a women's issue. In a lot of ways, yes, it is. Statistically, we know that women experience the majority of the gender-based violence here in the United States and around the world, and also children. But it's also important that we're speaking to the experiences of men who are survivors of violence and our transgender and our gender nonconforming communities as well. And I say this so that we can continue to make this issue inclusive and supportive of all survivors as we think of that kind of broad language, gender-based violence. From the advocacy side, which I represent, we typically use language also around, you might hear interpersonal violence. It's a common term that's used to include domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. All of these things that survivors may experience one or all three. This helps us to find common language to speak to the experiences of survivors and not assume who is a victim and who is a perpetrator, because these issues are incredibly nuanced and complex. Worldwide, we know that 1 in 3 women will experience abuse in their lifetime. That has been documented widely. Here in the United States, we know that some of those statistics fluctuate based on age. We know younger girls and women see the highest rates of violence. That's here and abroad. In the U.S., around 1 in 4 girls and college-age women experience some form of sexual assault. The White House, through their guidelines in the last year, are saying it's about 1 in 5 on college campuses. We see 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 based on our own research here on campus. As women age, the statistics stay the same. It is still 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 women will experience some form of interpersonal violence, whether it be domestic partner abuse, sexual violence, or stalking. For men, 1 in 6 boys experience abuse before the age of 18. Statistics we don't always talk about. 1 in 16 college-age men experience some form of sexual assault, and 1 in 33 men experience abuse as adults. And so I say that to know that this is happening in all communities, to all genders. For women, our statistical reality doesn't change. Abuse and violence are connected to how we walk through the world. It is very much a part of our experiences. Most of our research has focused on women, and we are now getting to a point where we are starting to be more expansive around our research, looking at who is experiencing sexual assault and how is it impacting our communities. And we know that it's impacting the LGBTQ community. It's impacting men. Are we creating spaces, safe spaces for all to come forward and seek resources? I think that is our next challenge. In 2010, the CDC, they conduct their research. It's the National Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Violence Survey. It's a widely used survey by advocates to get a pulse kind of nationally on where these issues are. And we're finally asking the sexual orientation question. We were not asking that before. So we are making progress around finding out who is impacted by these different issues. I think as we talk about a lot of these statistics and a lot of these numbers that are out there about who's experienced it, we also have to, I think in the same breath, talk about barriers to reporting and why survivors are not coming forward. It's the most underreported crime. For many reasons, we know that survivors do not come forward, whether it be their fear of not being believed, backlash from communities if they do come forward, and the shame that comes with these types of crimes. Identity also plays a major factor. Women of color are less likely to report. LGBTQ communities are less likely to report, and men are less likely to report because of a lot of the barriers in coming forward. Survivors who identify as having a disability are at higher risk and are also less likely to report. We also know that the conviction rate of perpetrators in the United States is at about 2 to 3%. It's incredibly low. And so if you're thinking as a survivor, why would I come forward if there's no opportunity to seek justice for what has happened? So that's a critical piece. And so I say all of this around the statistics and research so that not only we know that it's happening, we know that it's happening in so many different communities here in the U.S. and around the world. But we also have to understand why survivors aren't coming forward. And that is where the relationship between advocacy agencies and all of the folks supporting survivors and communities and the connection with religious and faith-based spaces is absolutely critical. Religious communities play a vital role in our care and advocacy of survivors and overall community efforts to end gender-based violence. As a former community-based advocate, I learned we cannot provide comprehensive care to survivors without our religious communities and institutions. I'll give you just a quick example before I hand it off. When I worked for my sister's place, we worked very hard to establish relationships and build bridges with the faith-based communities across the District of Columbia, because we knew that very much they have the pulse on what's happening with families and what the needs are. And they very much served as ambassadors in really, really powerful ways to say, how can we help you? How can we help you get to resources? Have you thought about calling a hotline? Do you know that these shelter services exist? And so that was vital. It was absolutely vital that we were working with all of the religious communities in the city. And it was fantastic work that we were able to do because it saves lives. A lot of the work that we're doing in building these community agencies and building up more spaces where survivors can feel safe to go is absolutely critical, because we as advocates see those results where we see lives are saved. So our partnership, again, Help to Save Lives, is important to continue building bridges and relationships on these issues, especially with religious communities. So thank you for having me today, and I look forward to our conversation. I'm going to hand it off to Emily. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all for inviting me here today. Rick Santos, my boss at IMA World Health, sends his regrets that he can't be here. He came down with a terrible cold. It's the first time in about 5 years I've ever seen him take a day off of work for illness. So here I am, and I hope I'm an acceptable substitute for him. My name is Emily Esworthy. I've been with IMA for about 5 years. I work both in the communications side as well as in our projects to end sexual and gender-based violence, both internationally and here in the U.S. IMA World Health is an international health organization, faith-based technical public health. So we walk this really interesting line between working with local governments and ministries of health to strengthen health systems, but also working in those communities to empower the faith leaders and the FBOs to be able to implement their health programs better. Because in a lot of the places where we work in post-conflict and developing nations, faith-based organizations provide as much as sometimes 70% of the healthcare in those areas. So it's really important that, this parallel system that, goes along with the health zones are together and working in tandem and strengthened on all sides. So I think that's what makes IMA unique and wonderful, that we kind of span this interesting space between technical and faith-based. And basically our flagship SGBV project is in Eastern Congo. It's funded by USAID, and it's called Ushindi. And its approach is a holistic one that incorporates medical care, psychosocial counseling, legal support, and literacy and job skills training for survivors and those affected by SGBV. And we're talking literally working with the local governments, the local health entities, and the local churches and faith bodies to spread the messages out to women that if you are raped, if you are abused, this is a place you can go. You can go to the hospital and be tested for HIV or have your injuries treated. You can get support for what you need. You can get counseling to work through this. And we're working to combat the stigma of being a victim or a survivor of abuse so that women can, approach their families and say, this is what happened to me, and they won't be pushed out onto the street by themselves. And if they are, which still is a frequent occurrence, we have the safety net of the economic support and the village savings and loans and the literacy training to help provide some safety net for the women to be able to, women and men, but primarily women, to be able to support themselves and learn skills to be able to, make a living and gain some independence. This program has a strong emphasis on the community-based organizations, such as women's groups, youth clubs, local churches, to spread the messages through local organizations that are more trusted maybe than, an outside entity coming in, so that if a church says, men, you need to respect your wives, let your girls go to school, encourage equality, it's a trusted message from a trusted person in the community. A year ago this week, I was in the Beni area of Eastern Congo, and we were talking with a church that just a few months before had taken these Ushindi messages really to heart and approached a local brothel that was very successful and helped to rescue the women. They paid off their debts. They talked to a brothel owner who was a female and encouraged her that there are other ways to make your living and that here are some things the church can enable you to do to help with that. And to me, that just spoke so highly of the approach of this program of empowering the local community to think and chew on these messages and then approach it in a way that was most suitable to their context. The thing about this program, though, is that as a faith-based organization, IMA really struggled with, how do we do this work internationally and then come and talk to our constituents here in the U.S. without doing something about the issues in our own communities? Because we know this is not something that just happens in Eastern Congo, even though it's in the news. It's something we really need to tackle here as well as faith-based organizations. So as we were sort of chewing on this issue, in 2011, our partners at Tear Fund released a study called Silent No More. And it focused on 5 countries. If I remember, it's Rwanda, Liberia, Burundi, Papua New Guinea. I can't remember the last one, I'm sorry. But it talked about the church's untapped potential to address sexual and gender-based violence. And the potential is huge worldwide. I mean, our churches are well connected. They often have a lot of funding. They have a lot of social influence. And so this report examined how that could work. And it led to the launch of a coalition called We Will Speak Out. It was launched in 2011 at Lambeth Palace with numerous NGOs from around the world joining in. And IMA was invited to join in because we have a massive network of faith organizations in the U.S. And we ended up launching our own U.S. sort of branch of this initiative over the last couple of years. And so We Will Speak Out U.S. is part of this global movement of organizations working together to advocate through the UN, through the recent event at the FCO in London, at the Sexual Violence and Conflict Summit in London last summer, as well as local initiatives in the home countries where we work. So IMA is basically the secretariat of that U.S. branch of this coalition. Here are members. I won't dwell on this, but it is a pretty diverse group thus far. We have 15 members, interfaith, and we're always looking to grow. Lots of people are doing amazing things, and the We Will Speak Out platform is really designed to amplify what is already being done. Not reinvent any wheels, but really to just keep the momentum going. There are many challenges to speaking out and empowering people to do so in the faith level. I won't go through all of these, but we realized you can't ask people to speak out unless they're adequately prepared, or else you risk re-victimizing them. So what we did was we created a study. It's basically a poll. We polled 1,000 U.S. Protestant pastors just to figure out where they are, what do they know, what do they do, because we didn't have this information to go on, and the pastors and other faith leaders didn't always respond to what we were doing because there was a lot of either ignorance or lack of awareness about the issues. And we discovered that what we assumed was true. A lot of pastors and faith leaders underestimate the level of violence. They speak very infrequently about it. And almost 1 in 10 are not at all familiar with the local resources in their communities that are available to survivors and victims of violence. And then we also found that a lot of faith leaders do incorrect things when approaching victims of violence, such as providing couples counseling in an issue of domestic violence, which is a dangerous thing to do, but 62% of pastors said they have done this. But we were encouraged that 8 in 10 said they would do more if they had the right training. So that for us was a jumping off point. And we learned a lot, but there are so many things that we still need to do. Like, how do we take this information and engage seminaries to train their faith leaders to do more? How do we change those attitudes that are, barriers to making this work happen? What are the proper tools that are needed? What's out there? How can we mobilize those tools to get to who they need to get to? And then how can we sort of unite the denominational level at the top with the grassroots work at the bottom to make sure at all levels there's buy-in and there's action being taken? And my last slide is just the next step for We Will Speak Out US is that we're taking this research another step forward with Harvard Divinity School to do some sort of on-the-ground work in the Boston area to really dig into what the faith communities there are doing, identifying some tools that could be utilized in other contexts and scaled up across the United States. So we'll see where that leads us over the summer. The results will be out, and then we'll kind of go from there and working with our communities and seeing how they can be adapted. So that's it for me. I will turn it over, and we can discuss later with any questions that you have. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Great. So thank you so much to the organizers for creating this. We heard Catherine mention this idea of creating space, and so I think this is a really good example of that. So I've been asked to share a little bit about what the Baha'i Faith is, what we're doing in relation to this issue, and kind of within the larger framework of why gender equality is an important issue to us, and then just have a little bit of a conversation about it. So for those of you that don't know, the Baha'i Faith is a monotheistic religion founded by Baha'u'llah in 19th century Persia, now Iran. The faith emphasizes the spiritual unity of all humankind, and both the prophet herald of the faith, known as the Bab, and the prophet founder came with a new social framework. Among the central teachings of the Baha'i Faith is the elimination of prejudices of all kind and the equality of women and men, among others. From the very early days of the faith, it has experienced great persecution in the land of its birth, Iran, and currently to this day in Iran and several other countries, Baha'is are very persecuted. There are several million Baha'is around the world in over 100,000 localities. Baha'is from Papua New Guinea to Japan to First Nations communities in Canada are really trying to learn about what the equality of women and men means and how to apply it in our communities. But of course, we live in this world, and like anybody else, we're really trying to understand what that means and how best to apply it. As a student of history, I find that we can derive great inspiration from history. And so there are two individuals that I think are noteworthy in Baha'i history that I just kind of like to point to, that I myself also personally derive great inspiration from, and I think are a model in our faith of gender equality. So the first is known as Tahireh, and she was one of the earliest followers of the prophet herald of the Baha'i faith, the Bab. So to just set a little bit of the historical context, 19th century Persia was a deeply segregated society. So one thing I always say is that even on doors, the door knocker for men and women was different, lest a man open and see a woman and vice versa. Women were essentially, something similar to a burqa. They were largely absent from the public sphere. And so what I think is really amazing is that Tahireh was, she was a poetess, a theologian, and she was actually very publicly seen and also publicly unveiled. And so I think her story is something that I derive great inspiration from. And she was killed for her beliefs, and she's noted to have said as her last words, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." Another noteworthy individual is the daughter of the prophet founder Baha'u'llah, known as Bahia Khanum. So Bahia Khanum accompanied her father through great exiles from Iran and through the Ottoman Empire. And she, what I find is of interest is that she acted as head of the religion on several occasions between 1910 and 1913. Now, to turn a little bit to some of the teachings of Baha'u'llah on gender equality, he has written, "Women and men have been and will always be equal in the sight of God." And so to kind of think about the best way to apply this and how this has implications on many areas. And one thing that I really like is that in the Baha'i writings, there's also a link between peace and gender equality. So it is written that peace is not possible until the equality of women and men is firmly established. So the son of the Prophet founder, Abdul Baha, has said this. So in a document that we use extensively in our office here in DC, the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity, they've written, "The ideas conveyed here presume that the equality of men and women is a fundamental truth about human reality and not just a desired condition to be achieved for the good of society." So now to turn a little bit to how our office works. So we are the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs. So we represent the U.S. Baha'i community to the U.S. government, to NGOs, and to the media. So there are offices similar to our office around the world. And there is also an office, the Baha'i International Community, which represents the global Baha'i community, and they have offices in Geneva and in New York. So the way we work, we partner with several national level coalitions, including the Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, as well as working on gender equity in education. We also work on issues related to the engagement of men and boys. I believe the first speaker kind of noted how important that was. So in November, I was in Delhi for the second Men Engaged Global Symposium, as that's really a critical piece of all of this. And so we are, as a faith, not involved in partisan politics, but there are several pieces of bipartisan legislation that we also support. So those are the Violence Against Women Act, the International Violence Against Women Act, and the UN Women's Treaty, CEDAW. So we also do work, in addition to the legislative work, work in our grassroots, which is always really fun and exciting for me. So we've done several, I think, over 10 different sessions at universities and in different spaces. So just 2 weeks ago, we were at MIT talking with a group of scientists about gender equality and what that means to them. And also we do work in local Baha'i communities addressing issues of domestic violence, preventing sexual assault. So in January, we had 2 sessions, one in Santa Cruz, California, with about 60 adults, where we looked at really our spiritual attitudes to equality. So really kind of seeing that violence is one of the many symptoms of an ailing social order, and that really it requires deep spiritual work to look at what our attitudes are and how we value women and men. So we have these great teachings, but if in our communities the women are seen as being responsible for the hospitality and the men are the speakers, there's a real problem there. So how can we actually talk about those things? And also in January at the Northern Virginia Baha'i School, at the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center, we had about 100 individuals gathered for a domestic violence training. And it was really interesting. The event was conducted entirely in Persian, and so it was very good because it was culturally appropriate. We had traditional Persian music, but we also really looked at a handbook put out by the national governing body of the Baha'is of the U.S. And what they have written in this handbook is, the National Spiritual Assembly wishes to convey a clear message that acts of domestic violence are at complete variance with the teachings of Baha'u'llah, and that violence in the family is a practice to be condemned. So really looking through this extensive document and having that as our central piece that it needs to be done away with. So just to conclude, this is an issue that's also very personal for me. I come from generations of feminists who worked on issues of girls' education and women's health in Iran, and it's something that I look forward to, partnering with all of you to really think about the way we can advance this really, really critical issue. And to conclude, I'll end with the document that I referenced earlier, which writes, "Advancing the equality of women and men cannot be conceived only in terms of bringing women into the various arenas of the current social order. It must involve women and men striving together to build a new social order." Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. As I was introduced earlier, my name is Aisha Rahman, and I'm the Executive Director of Karama, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. So what I'd like to do with my short time here, because I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with all of you, is to talk a little bit about Karama's history, why we were founded, what our approach is to this and other issues, and then move to what we are actually doing. And then moving forward, I think you all would be able to help us in conversations on moving forward. Karama was founded over 20 years ago by a group of 3 Muslim women lawyers who were all working on Wall Street. They were corporate attorneys. They really were not engaged in gender work or social advocacy in any sense, but they were really upset at the portrayal of Islam globally and in the United States, and more particularly the portrayal of Muslim women. And it seemed that everyone wanted to talk in Muslim women's voices and talk about how oppressed Muslim women were, and yet a lot of that oppression was also blamed and attributed to the religion of Islam. And so as 3 strong Muslim women who were attorneys, who were highly functioning, who enjoyed their rights, they were very affronted, especially since some of them had been involved in the feminist movement in the United States and globally. And this idea that others would speak in your voice and tell you that you were oppressed really rocked the very foundation of the feminist movement. And so they decided that there needed to be an organization that talked about Muslim women talking about their issues from a religious perspective and a legal perspective. And the legal perspective is important because in Islamic law, and I'm not going to give you a dissertation on Islamic law right now, the enjoyment of rights for Muslim women really comes from a legal framework in the religion and in society. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the conversation. But the reality is, and I think our first speaker spoke a little bit about patriarchy and this issue of lack of engagement with faith communities because of patriarchy. I think that one element of patriarchy is to keep people ignorant of what their rights are. That is the mechanism of power and control. And the reality is that Muslim women and Muslim societies in general need to know their rights in order to advocate for them. And so Karama really stands first and foremost as an educational organization. Our founders and in the early years of Karama, probably for the first decade, our focus was on research. Let us research the religion, let us research Islamic law, and talk really who are the scholars who are talking about women's rights and gender equity from an Islamic perspective. That launched sort of the foundation of our organization. So if you go to our website, you will find numerous articles that talk about women's rights from an Islamic perspective. You'll also find articles about religious freedom and democracy, because the idea is that you can't tell a woman that she has certain rights and then she goes to advocate for them in court and there's a corrupt system. There's a corrupt legal system that is not really giving her and affording her her rights, despite the fact that the religion may say that she has them. So our approach is that when we have a legal issue, we look at it both from an Islamic legal perspective and a U.S. civil legal perspective. And then we break that down further and we do education and advocacy. So on the issue of gender-based violence, one of the things that I think is very important that we should talk about is actually working with the community itself. So I think, one of the things that has come out a lot in this conversation is access to justice. So when you talk to the Muslim community, part of our education, there's twofold pieces of our education. First is to talk to the broader community of service providers. Karama has gotten several grants from the Department of Justice and other funding organizations to really provide cultural and religious sensitivity to people who are providing services to the Muslim community. And I think that that's very important, because what we see is that when we are serving people who are survivors of domestic violence, for example, they may have so many ancillary issues that are not related to the violence piece. So they may have a companion immigration case. They may have financial limitations. They may not have the ability to work or the right to work because of their visa status, et cetera. And so them even coming to your office and trying to talk to you about what's going on with them is a challenge, is a barrier. And so we need to sort of broaden this idea of what is advocacy on the violence pieces. Of course, this is not exclusive to the Muslim community, and we work with many communities of color, but that's one important piece. Language access is another piece of our advocacy. We know that there are so many barriers in our legal system for women and men to come in and tell their story if they don't have an interpreter. So, of course, you're entitled to an interpreter. You're legally, you're supposed to have an interpreter, and yet, for some reason, it is a barrier, continues to be a barrier. Another issue that we see a lot in the Muslim community and other faith communities is this idea of stigma surrounding sexual violence and domestic violence and other gender-based violence. So, I have a case study, for example, in Maine. Karama works very closely with a Somali, mostly Somali community in Maine, and they were telling me that when they do have 2 certified interpreters that go to court with survivors of DV, and they've had those interpreters say, do you really want to talk about these issues? Like they're back talking in their language to the witness instead of doing simultaneous interpretation. Do you really want to air the dirty laundry of your family? Things of that nature. Those are things that we need to know about, and we need to know how to combat against, because I think in the realm of theory we can talk, and I can talk for hours about how Islam as a religion would advocate for the rights of women and against domestic violence and sexual violence, and then the trickle-down effect and how we actually see justice served in our communities is very different. I will add quickly, because I'm running out of time, that beyond advocacy, what Karama does, based in our scholarship and our education, we've sort of moved beyond that a little bit. Our scholars are still engaging in research from an Islamic perspective. That's always happening. But we've also started to provide direct legal services, and that is a relatively new advent at Karama. We've only been doing it for about a year and a half. And the reason is this. We were going around and educating locally and globally about the rights afforded to Muslim women from an Islamic perspective and how to advocate for them in civil legal arenas. And we started getting calls. We get calls from all over the world every day where women are saying, well, I'm going through a divorce and X, Y, and Z is happening, or I'm being abused and I'm not sure how to do it. And locally in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia areas, we started to feel that there's a we're severely underserved as a community, and that is because of all of these access to justice issues that I was mentioning to you before. So Karama has expanded its mission and vision into providing direct legal services, and so I would ask you if you all know of anyone who needs help, who needs a resource, we are here. And I'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about sort of how we deal with Muslim leaders and imams, because I know that that's going to be something that you all are interested in. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm the last speaker, and what incredible speakers I have to follow. So thank you for everything that's been said. I'm Jen Schweer. I work here at Georgetown. I'm the Associate Director for Health Education Services and oversee our office's sexual assault response and prevention services. which also includes domestic violence, stalking, all of the interpersonal violence issues that we've been talking about. I've been asked to speak today briefly on my role as a clinician. I'm a licensed counselor and have been doing advocacy and clinical work with survivors for the majority of the 14 years that I've been working in this field. I started off by working in a community agency, as Laura did, in Lincoln, Nebraska for 4 years, working at a crisis center, working with domestic violence, sexual assault survivors, and have been at Georgetown for 8.5 years. So have been doing this work and have been asked to speak a little bit about the integration of how we use the support of a religious community or faith-based community in working directly with survivors. I think one of the things that comes up a lot in conversation is that there seems to be sort of this history of thinking that if somebody is feminist or doing this work or really out there, that somehow that means anti-faith or anti-religion. There's some mistrust there in those conversations. So I think there can be sometimes, and all of the former speakers before me have alluded to this, but there's definitely there has to be more conversation and education, because in order to get leaders within religious communities to know and see us as resources and services, it's about understanding that we are not somehow saying your religion is wrong, your faith is wrong. And in fact, any good practitioner or clinician will be integrating that if that is a part of someone's identity. So I'll give you some examples with students who I work with. I primarily respond to students in crisis, which means, and the crisis can be right after an event, an incident happens. It can be a year later when something is triggered. But they usually end up seeing me being referred by somebody else saying, because this has become something they don't feel like they can manage on their own anymore. And part of understanding who's sitting in front of me is understanding their whole identity and understanding who knows about this, or who have you leaned on for support, or who are the support systems, or where are the support systems in your life. That's generally where conversations about faith will come out. So as an example, very recently I've had a student who I've seen in an ongoing way, and for her, going to Mass feels like a really safe place. That's a really a place where she goes just in general when she's feeling anxious or upset. That's kind of part of what has brought her comfort in the past. So we integrate that. So when she's seeing me and things are feeling really out of control and things are feeling really unsafe, or she's feeling triggered, that's part of our plan for her. That's not part of our plan for everyone who's in my office, because that doesn't work for everyone. But that's one very small example. So we work really hard, and again, good advocates and practitioners will do that and make sure that we're saying, this is something that you see as a support in your life, your faith, your religion. How can we make sure this is a part of your plan? So beyond this office, we're integrating that and using that. The other piece of that we do at Georgetown, and that the other speakers have spoken about happening on community levels, is we partner very closely with our campus ministry programs. And we do programs with them, because it goes back to that accessibility, right? So last year I did a program on a residence hall floor with one of the chaplains in residence. And the chaplains in residence are from all faith backgrounds. But it allows students to be able to say, oh, okay, so students who might usually go to her or to somebody else around these issues, they see that we're aligned and that she trusts me and that I'm somebody who can come in and add to that conversation. And so because I think there's a really good working relationship between our campus ministry colleagues and our office, which we've made sure to very intentionally nurture throughout the years, a large part of our client population comes to us from campus ministry, because students feel comfortable going to a priest or a pastor or their chaplain in residence and a mom saying, this happened to me, perhaps. Or they can talk to me first and I can help facilitate that back if that's something that they're interested in doing. But I think it's the starting point of understanding there's no agenda from my office in any direction, which is where that misunderstanding can come in terms of thinking like, well, if I send you to this advocate in the community or this person on campus, will they totally cut this piece out altogether or encourage you to do these things that are against our faith or our religious beliefs? And so I think the biggest piece is the understanding and the awareness and the partnership and starting there. So I actually am going to wrap up so there's time for dialogue, but wanted to share that piece as just kind of an on-the-ground, working day-to-day with survivors, and kind of that's something I do at Georgetown is try to really have that conversation, that partnership exists, and that our centers and our offices are safe places for those dialogues for our students as well to help bridge those gaps. So thank you very much.